The Ancestral Trail, Book 4, Mirra the Magician. Published by Marshall Cavendish, 1993. Based on a story by Frank Graves. Melek and Orcan stood silent, helpless bystanders in the war of nerves unfolding in front of them. Richard's eyes flickered from pod to spider, calculating distances, weighing up chances. It was clearly a stalemate. Finally, Orcan made the choice for him. "Run!" he shouted. "Leave the pod! If you try for it now, Baal will kill you. We'll come back for it." And with Orcan chivying everyone along, they soon put a safe distance between themselves and the spider. As they ran, Richard noticed something strange about the forest. Although night was closing in, the tangled boughs were lit as clearly as if it were day. Stranger still, their shadows seemed to have multiplied into an eerie fan of alternating light and dark, which gave Richard the impression of running through strobes. The ground was rising gently underfoot, and after a while Richard realised he was running up a steep slope. When he reached the top, he turned to the others, but Orcan, dragging Melek by the arm, barrelled into him over the ridge. "Don't stop!" Orcan shouted. Richard had little choice. The ground fell away sharply beneath him, and once over the edge he had little hope of climbing back. Neither did the others. Propelled by Orcan's energy, the three slithered helplessly down a bank of straggly trees. They found themselves standing in a dry, sandy gulch. Above their heads, the stars were blotted out by 10 evenly spaced moons, whose radiance cast a web of shadows over the landscape. In the conflicting light, the rectangular white block of a walled city stood out, set near the bottom of the valley. "Look there," Richard said, pointing at the buildings. "We might find someone to help us get the pod back." The companions made their way to the walled city in silence. 2 gigantic pillars of stone greeted them at the main gates. Looking beyond, they saw a smooth avenue of white houses slashed by dark alleyways. The whole place had a still, silent quality. When the trio started to explore, Richard saw why. Everything Richard looked at in the city was made of stone. Even the creatures who had been running in all directions were frozen in flight. On every face was etched an expression of horror. The three wandered awestruck through the silent throng. "I think this is Petropolis," Melek announced, "the stronghold of Mirra the magician. I have heard many stories about her. She is very evil and very powerful. They say that she can turn people to stone with a nick of her sickle."
"That explains the style of her decoration," Orcan snorted, but Richard felt that he was hiding his fear. At the end of the street they came into an impressive square. It was huge and edged on all 4 sides by a series of dark, arched colonnades. Wherever they looked, they saw enormous birds, frozen in action, some brandishing swords, others on the ground, left under threat of an enemy which had suffered the same dismal fate. "They must have been turned to stone in the middle of a battle," Orcan mused.
And then Richard saw a statue of a majestic bird towering above all the rest. "Who on earth is this?" he asked, his eyes wide with admiration. The three approached the statue cautiously. Their footsteps echoed around the square, despite the layer of fine dust that covered the well-worn flagstones. The statue resembled a huge eagle, with eyes that were deep and fierce, but which had a curiously benevolent slant. In one taloned fist, the statue hoisted a mace, spiked and deadly, but frozen forever in mid-blow. At its feet lay a giant earwig, whose expression showed bitter defiance as it waited for the bird to cast the final blow. "I think this is Jarut," Melek said quietly. A hint of awe made his voice sound a bit trembly. "He is, or rather was, the guardian of birds and the keeper of truth.
Well, if he's a guardian, Richard said, we've got to try and free him.
Well, Mirra is the only one who can reverse the spell, Melek said. They say she uses a pair of mirrors and the light of the moons, but only she knows how. He looked at his companions. Maybe the prophecy will help.
They waited as Melek turned the pages and read aloud.
An acrid layer dissolves to stone. An acrid layer devolves to stone. The sorceress is now full grown. A sickle's strike one mighty felled, by burning letters evil quelled. One orb purple, one orb blue. Night light helps release the true. Survive the fight, regain the prize. Beyond the height, a fine surprise.
I wish these prophecies were easier to understand, Orcan said wistfully. All I can make out is that there'll be a fight, and somehow we'll survive it. Richard looked at the verse again. I don't understand where the burning letters come in, he said thoughtfully, but it does say we'll get the prize, and, well, that's got to be the pod. The sorceress must be Mirra, so we had better be very careful while we're in Petropolis. The dwarf shut the heavy tome and hoisted it back onto his shoulders. I don't think we'll have to look very far for Mirra, Orcan muttered, looking across the square. A tall, red-haired figure had emerged from one of the dark arches and was sidling noiselessly in their direction. They stared, transfixed, as Mirra came closer. She wore long dark robes and gold bracelets shaped like serpents. In the strange moonlight the metal glinted, making the snakes seem almost alive on her arms. In one hand she carried a small sickle, and in the other 2 round mirrors.
I see you are admiring my collection, Mirra said sharply. Very fine, isn't it?
Her voice was cold. She fixed the trio with watchful eyes, and she drifted closer. I must distract her, Richard thought, tugging nervously at Golan's amulet. And suddenly the guardian's voice floated in his mind. Give her the badge. Richard faced the magician. You must be Mirra, he said. My friends and I have travelled far to find you. He unclipped Muldoon's badge and held it out. The Evil One has sent us to give you this as a reward for your loyalty. Mirra sighed with satisfaction. She tucked the mirrors and sickle under one arm and stretched out her hand. As she fastened the ornament to her robes, Mirra looked at the trio.
Now, I must give you something too. I know. You shall have immortality among my collection of statues.
She raised her sickle. Richard glanced at his companions. Orcan and Melek were looking round in desperation. Neither could see any obvious way of escape. Then Richard tugged at Orcan's sleeve. Mirra's robes were beginning to smoulder. Muldoon's badge was glowing with a deep red heat. Suddenly the mysterious script on its rim that Richard had read earlier spat out across Mirra's chest in flaming, liquid drops of burning metal. The magician screamed angrily. "Ah!" She dropped the sickle and the mirrors, and she beat desperately at the source of her agony. Richard moved quickly. Seizing the sickle, he struck at her robes. Before he made contact, an icy hand closed around his wrist. For an instant, Mirra's eyes met Richard's. They were filled with utter hatred. And then the flames reached her face, and she snatched back her hand to claw at her burning face. Her bracelet seemed to writhe in pain as the flames licked around Mirra's wrists. Quickly, Richard bore down with the sickle again. He felt it catch on her robe and struck again with all his strength. When he felt the sickle sink into flesh, he quickly pulled it away. When Richard looked up again, Mirra was an angular statue.
frozen in a posture of agony. Yet still the brooch burned on. Choking and scattering for fresh air, the trio turned away from the burning effigy. After the smoke had cleared, they stared in awe at what remained of Mirra. She had dissolved into a black pool of lava, cooling rapidly and already covered with a brittle crust of pumice. The badge was nowhere to be seen. Richard felt as if his legs were made of cotton wool, so he sat down on the cold flags and laid the sickle down beside him. "Maybe we can have some rest after we free Jarut," Melek said. Jarut! Richard had almost forgotten about the Guardian. "We must work out how to reverse the spell. Melek, you said that Mirra used the mirrors and the moonlight, and the prophecy mentioned blue and purple orbs?" He looked at the web of bright beams in the dark sky. The moons were white. "Now, how are we going to get blue and purple lights to shine on Jarut?" he asked aloud.
"Well, that's easy," Orkan said. "I'll show you."
He grabbed a mirror and held it to catch the light from one of the moons. Soon he had a beam of light playing over Jarut's face. "Well, that must be the way," Richard said. "But we need the light from blue and purple moons."
Orkan looked upwards at the sky and shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "Let's just wait and see what happens at dawn. Maybe the moons will look different in the daylight or something."
So they flopped down on the stone floor to wait for dawn. With Mirra reduced to a shapeless lump, the huge square had lost its air of menace, and soon the trio fell asleep. Sunrise came cautiously over Mirra's city, and it was a few minutes before the three realised what was happening. "Get up!" Richard shouted. "Quick!" He and Orkan each took a mirror. Above them, the moons were reacting violently to the daylight. As the sky brightened, they began to change colour, flickering a little before glowing in all of the colours of the rainbow. Richard and Orkan adjusted their mirrors until the blue and the purple light beams met on Jarut's stony features. The mirrors shook as two bolts of pure energy shot out, making an audible rip in the air as they sped towards their target. Nothing happened at first, and then Richard saw a tinge of colour begin to spread over Jarut's stony features.
"Richard, get back!" Orkan shouted. "The mace!"
Looking up, Richard and Melek saw that Jarut's mace was beginning to move. The blow was already about to fall directly where they were standing. The three scattered just in time. The mace thundered to the ground with unbelievable force, sending a network of fine cracks shivering across the courtyard and spattering their heels with a hail of stony shrapnel. For a moment, Jarut's eagle eyes followed the three with deadly intent. But when his eyes stared into Richard's, they widened in surprise.
"So the prophecy was right," he exclaimed, looking directly at Richard. "The one who sees in dark and light."
Jarut's fierce features softened into benevolence.
"You have done well to free me from Mirra's spell."
He stepped away from the figure at his feet. Unstrapping a dagger from his belt, Jarut handed it to Richard.
"Ha ha ha! Take this," he said. "It will serve you well on your quest. Now, tell me, what on earth has been happening?"
"Thank you," Richard said. In his hands, the dagger looked more like a sword. Richard strapped it onto his own belt, and he told Jarut about their recent encounters. The Guardian nodded his approval, but when he had heard that Richard had left the pod with Baal, Jarut's face fell.
"You must go back. If even one pod remains with the evil forces, all your efforts will be in vain. Don't worry, you can overcome Baal if you use the sickle."
As Richard stepped forward, he saw a grey shadow shoot from the ground and wrap a thin rope around Jarut's neck. "Watch out!" he screamed. The shadow arched against the Guardian's back, trying to drag him to the floor, but already Jarut had raised his mace and sent his attacker crashing to the ground. It was the earwig soldier that had lain at Jarut's feet.
"Some of those moonbeams must have shone on him and reversed his spell as well," Jarut said. There's more of his kind out there, so you be on your guard. Now, Girut went on, I've got to free the rest of my forces and continue the fight. He looked up at the bright moon still wheeling in the pale morning sky, and Richard handed him the mirrors. As they walked around the square, Girut stopped and caught the moonbeams on the mirrors. Richard marvelled at his accuracy, as one after the other he brought his armoured bird forces back to life. As colour rose back in each of them, each bird took a step forward, and he saluted their leader, Girut. And as he worked, the Guardian told the trio about his capture and the rise of the Evil One. It had started on quite a small scale, and then it had got worse. People went missing first, one, then two, then three, then whole villages. Wells were poisoned, and farms were burnt to the ground. It soon became clear that the whole fabric of the ancestral world was gradually being undermined by some unseen force. Guardians were dispatched to find out more, but they too had disappeared. Girut had been the third to venture forth and not return.
You have much to do and very little time,
Girut told Richard at last.
Go back and recover the pod from Baal. I shall continue here. Goodbye, and good luck.
Girut raised his mace in salute and farewell as the three set off through the city gates and back up the hill to the Cobweb Wood. The going was harder than they had expected. By the time they reached Baal's forest, sweat was pouring off of Melek, who had to be hauled up the ridge by Orcan.
I must rest a while. These books seem to be getting heavier and heavier,
Melek complained in a breathless voice. Well, there's only one, Orcan snapped. I know it's heavy, but you...
There's another one too, Melek interrupted, catching his breath.
What other one? Richard asked.
Oh, it's a book about monsters and magic, Melek said. I have it in my pocket.
Well, get rid of it then, Orcan said, annoyed at the dwarf for holding them up.
No, Melek protested. It might help us to outwit the evil one.
Well, let's see it then, Orcan said. Melek gave a smug grin as he produced a small, battered book from his pocket. The pages were made of worn parchment, and the cover bore an ancient script which read, Morbane's Book of Monsters and Magic. Well, how do you think the book will help us? Richard asked.
Well, Morbane was the oldest and wisest of our magicians. He travelled the ancestral world and wrote about the monsters he encountered. He describes the beasts and their magical powers, and even how some of them can be defeated. One of the stories almost matches what happened to us with Sumar, the moss beast, and I'm sure there's one about a monster turning people to stone, Melek said. He was proud of his knowledge. Richard agreed that the book could be useful. We'll look at it later, he said to Melek, but now we must concentrate on getting that pod back. Melek nodded with a satisfied smile, and he put the book back into his pocket. Cautiously, the three made their way back to the clearing. Lotan, the serpent, his body lay where it had fallen, but there was little left of the monstrous snake which had once held Richard in its coils. Huge soldier ants had eaten away at his carcass. They had stripped the flesh from the bone, and they had done it with terrifying efficiency. Richard shuddered as he watched the ants scurrying about, finishing off the last shreds of meat. Lotan's body had been reduced to clean white bones, as if it had been dipped in acid. Oh, let's move on, Richard said in disgust. We'll head for Baal's larder and wait for him there. But just then they heard the familiar trampling noise. Baal was already after them. You distract him, Richard whispered, and I'll circle round behind. They nodded, and Richard melted silently into the undergrowth. Melek stepped behind Orcan, whose sword was already in his hand. At any moment they expected Baal's sticky strands of silk to come lancing towards them. Instead, the giant spider took a series of rapid, darting steps that brought him within arm's length of the brave pair. Orcan could see no sign of Richard. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw him.
edging behind Baal. Following Orkan's gaze, Baal sprang abruptly into the air, hurling himself backwards across the clearing. The huge spider reared up as he landed behind Richard, who spun on his heels. From beneath Baal's bulk, he saw the venomous pincers open and close in anticipation. Summoning up all his strength, Richard hurled Mirra's sickle into Baal's soft belly. Then he raced over to Orkan and Melek. When he turned back, he found himself facing a statue of a spider with a sickle stuck firmly in its underside. But suddenly, the statue began to wobble. It was too heavy. It toppled forward, and it buried the sickle forever beneath an immovable lump of rock. Richard gasped with breath. "Hand me the Pathfinder," he said in a shaky voice. "Let's find the pod and get out of here." He held out the instrument, and after a while gold trembled at the arrow's tip. In silence the companions forged their way through cobweb wood, until they emerged in one of Baal's cocoon-filled larders. Richard stared at the clusters of silk bundles. There were many more than he could count, and the thought of what they contained made his blood run cold. "There it is," Orkan pointed. Within one of the cocoons lay the pod, barely visible amongst the webs and shimmering balls of silk. Richard scooped it up. "Whew! How on earth did you manage to see it?" he asked, feeling the comforting warmth of the pod in his cupped hands. "Well, I'm used to looking for hidden things," Orkan replied mysteriously. Glad to have got the pod back so quickly, Richard suggested that they head back to the ridge. "The prophecy mentioned a surprise beyond the height," he said. After a while they reached the ridge, and saw below them the steep tree-clad slope down which they had tumbled earlier. "Well, there seems to be a path of sorts," Orkan said, taking the lead. The track, however, became narrower and narrower, until they found themselves out of the trees and on a slender spit of rock that projected over a massive abyss. "We'll never get down there," Richard sighed, staring into the darkness below. "What about Melek's rope?" Orkan suggested. The words were hardly out of his mouth when there was a cracking sound from beneath their feet. The narrow rock shook briefly and tumbled into space. With it went Orkan, Melek, and Richard.